It comes back to me most evenings, though I never ask for it. The way a sound travels in those ancient quads, the shuffle of a heel or the sudden laugh of a boy lingering too late beneath the windows. Memory makes it sharper now than it ever was at the time. I hear a cough that wasn't mine, a door that closed with unnecessary caution, a voice that seemed to pause before speaking as though caught between guilt and bravado. Oxford at dusk has always been more theatre than city. The stones take on a colour like old parchment, brittle, uneven. Rainwater carries the ink of leaves into the gutters. On that particular evening I had been persuaded, half reluctantly, into dining in the hall with a former Don who still believed himself more brilliant than his colleagues had ever admitted. The wine was poor, and the conversation poorer, and I excused myself before dessert, preferring solitude to the forced conviviality of men who never quite abandoned the competition of youth. Crossing the quad, I slowed beneath a cloister where a single lamp sputtered against the mist. The hour was not late, yet the silence carried a peculiar weight, as though the college were listening to itself. That was when I heard two notes, not quite music, more an experiment in sound, a whistle, a fragment of a hymn. The echo drew it out, gave it shape, and left me standing motionless with a half-forgotten line of poetry in my head about voices lingering longer than their owners. It would have been nothing had I not later found that the bursar had died before midnight, discovered in his narrow chamber with a face that looked less surprised than resigned. Death in the academic world seldom comes without a small file of footnotes. He had been, according to most, an unremarkable man, diligent with accounts, cautious with praise. But there was already a murmur that certain sums had drifted, unrecorded, toward ends unknown. Men whose lives are measured in careful columns seldom allow themselves the indulgence of mystery, yet mystery arrived all the same, and with it I. I walked the quad again that night alone after the body had been taken away. The echo returned, not with sound but with absence. I tried to reconstruct the faint whistle I had heard earlier. Two notes close together, a minor interval. I tested it under my breath and realized it belonged to a hymn frequently sung in chapel. Abide with me, not the grand verse, but the hidden middle one, the words, most forget. Hold though they cross before my closing eyes. A coincidence, perhaps, but coincidence, I have always thought, is just the camouflage fate wears when it wishes to go unnoticed. Lewis-kind, patient Lewis, had asked me the next morning if I was troubled. He had noticed me restless, turning over a crossword in the pub with unusual persistence. I told him only that the clue refusing to resolve itself was 6 across, a 4-letter word for debt. I knew the answer was IOTS, trivial, unworthy, and yet I delayed, penciling other possibilities. Sometimes the simplest explanation is not the most comforting. Later that day, I returned to the bursar's office, permitted by the warden who disliked fuss, but disliked scandal even more. The room smelt faintly of ink and tobacco. Papers lay stacked with monastic precision. On the window-sill, a small puddle of rain had crept through the ill-fitting frame. Nothing moved except the curtain, which breathed in and out with the draught like the lungs of someone dreaming. On the desk I noticed an account book, perfectly ordinary, except for one line written in a hand that hurried where all else was careful. A sum had been erased, then rewritten, higher than before. People make mistakes, yes, but this had the anxious neatness of a man trying to cover a hole too large for his shovel. In my mind I heard those two notes in the quad again. A man, alone, reminding himself of a hymn about final vision, final surrender, a premonition, or a signal to another ear besides mine. I walked out into the corridor, and the porter, whose uniform always seemed too large for him, nodded with the weary solemnity of someone who sees death often enough to dislike it, but not often enough to become indifferent. He mentioned, almost carelessly, that the bursar had lately been keeping unusual hours, leaving his chambers late at night. To walk, he said, or so he told me. But the man limped, and walking would hardly be his pleasure. We notice small things and then we ignore them until they circle back. That limp left leg dragging slightly. And when I retraced my steps across the flagstones, I realized the sound I had half registered during that evening's echo, the heel striking fractionally later than the toe, was exactly the rhythm of his step. So it was him I had heard in the quad making that small, uncertain music. A dying man's song, or a man rehearsing the role of one. By the time I returned to my rooms, the crossword still unfinished, I knew only that his death was neither simple nor entirely his own. I poured myself a measure of whiskey, the cheap kind that burns with more honesty than the expensive bottles, and allowed the night to advance without interruption. Memory, as ever, refused to quieten, the quad, the echo, the hymn, all waiting to be deciphered, like an unsent letter left deliberately where only one pair of eyes might find it. And so the case began, not with a body but with a sound that lingered in stone. Morning light, when it does arrive in Oxford, has a curious way of presenting itself as both gift and intrusion. It does not brighten so much as uncover, dragging reluctant stones and tired scholars into the day. That particular morning, I found myself walking with little purpose beyond the need to postpone decisions. Lewis had urged breakfast, but I excused myself. The idea of sitting before rashers and tea seemed vulgar when a man had gone to bed with thoughts unfinished and had not risen to complete them. The porter's lodge drew me in with its dim glow, as it so often does. It is the confessional booth of the university. All secrets sooner or later pass through that narrow space where men sign their names and collect their letters. The smell struck me first, ink and tobacco overlaying the damp of worn stone. The porter himself, large-jawed and heavy in posture, glanced at me with the recognition of someone who knows that investigators seldom arrive without cause. He made a show of leafing through papers, though I sensed he had already been waiting for me. Spread across his desk was the morning's newspaper, folded not by habit, but by intention. One corner lifted, betraying the smudge of fingers that had lingered too long. I asked, without asking, whether he had read the account. He nodded, eyes lowered. The article was brief. Bursar found dead. Police consider natural causes. College declines comment. Nothing surprising, nothing useful. Yet in the margin a thin penciled line traced beneath a sentence, diligent in his duties, admired by colleagues. A small defacement, meaningless perhaps, but made by someone unwilling to let the record stand uncontested. It is odd how print carries more weight than speech. A whisper fades in air, but words preserved in newsprint demand allegiance or correction. I held the sheet a moment longer than courtesy allowed, thinking of the bursar's pale face, the erased account entry, the whistle in the quad. I laid it down again, careful to align it as I had found it. The porter cleared his throat in a manner suggesting both reluctance and inevitability. He mentioned slowly that the bursar had called in late deliveries of certain papers in recent weeks, papers not subscribed to by the college. The Financial Times, for instance. An indulgence or a necessity? His salary was not one that permitted speculative play, yet there are always those who imagine themselves cleverer than the odds. Lewis arrived then, bringing with him the smell of rain still caught in his coat. He offered no greeting, only the quiet remark that the coroner would be content with heart failure as explanation. I did not reply. Instead, I found my eyes drawn to a second newspaper, stacked beneath the first. Not today, but 2 days passed. Its front page bore a headline about a collapsed firm in the city. Investments vanished, investors silent. I felt, without yet articulating, the faint tug of connection. Men do not erase sums in ledgers without reason, nor do they whistle hymns in darkened quads unless fear already lodges in the throat. We left the lodge together, though Lewis walked at a pace less hurried than mine. He asked if I thought scandal was likely. I told him the scandal was always likely to be the currency of closed institutions. What mattered was not likelihood, but direction, who had most to gain from silence, and who had most to lose if speech began. Crossing the quad again, the echo seemed muted. Students hurried with books pressed to their sides, unaffected by death in a chamber they would never enter. A blackbird, restless, darted from gutter to stone. Its call, sharp and sudden, reminded me of a crossword clue I had attempted the night before. 1 down, 7 letters, meaning silence. The muffled answer had at first eluded me. Yet seeing the porter's penciled line, the newspaper folded to conceal its heart, I realized how often silence is less absence than arrangement. We returned briefly to the bursar's rooms. The air had already cooled. Death, when removed, takes warmth with it. On the desk I noticed an envelope half-slipped beneath a stack of correspondence, not addressed, not sealed. Inside, a clipping neatly cut from an earlier paper report on the same financial collapse I had glimpsed in the lodge. No commentary, no note, just the article itself, preserved like evidence for an argument never delivered. Lewis frowned at it, then looked toward me as though waiting for permission to interpret. I gave him none. Instead, I remarked that people seldom collect articles without some expectation of needing them. A reminder, a warning, a shield? He said only that it looked like the habit of a worried man. I thought otherwise. Worry manifests in pacing, in sleepless eyes. Clippings are for men who expect to justify themselves. We left as quietly as we had entered. The porter, still in his lodge, met my glance with something near defiance. He knew more than he had spoken, but porters, like priests, consider discretion a virtue. Still, the penciled line beneath diligence in his duties betrayed him. He did not believe it, and in not believing, he had already placed himself as witness against the official account. Outside, rain began again, tentative drops across the quad that fell with the irregularity of hesitant confession. I thought of the hymn once more, the 2 notes carried in echo. Abide with me. The bursar had sought something to cling to, perhaps in numbers, perhaps in faith, perhaps only in the comfort of routine. And yet what he clung to had failed him. Lewis pressed me for next steps. I told him only that newspapers often reveal more in their margins than in their headlines. He smiled faintly, not understanding, and lit a cigarette he did not enjoy. The smoke curled upward, dispersing before it reached the arch of the cloister. A fitting metaphor, though I let it pass unsaid. That evening, alone again with my crossword, I stared at another clue, 9 across, 6 letters, meaning truth concealed. The answer, obvious once seen, was subtle, and it occurred to me that subtlety was precisely what had led me from echo to ledger to newsprint. A chain of almost nothings, waiting to declare themselves. I poured whiskey, leaned back, and listened to the rain. Somewhere in the college, the porter folded his newspapers for the night. Somewhere beyond, in the city, money shifted silently from one pocket to another, and in my mind the bursar's quiet whistle repeated itself, a hymn half swallowed by stone. It was not grief that filled me then, nor even curiosity, but the peculiar certainty that the story offered in print was already false. And once falsehood takes hold in a place dedicated to knowledge, it spreads faster than any truth could hope to follow. St. Simeon's has always seemed to me less a college than a walled confession. Its gates do not simply close, they exhale resignation. The very stones, darkened by centuries of drizzle and smoke, lean inward as if attempting to protect secrets that have grown brittle with age. I knew as I stepped through the archway that morning that I was entering not just a place of learning but a self-contained world whose inhabitants trusted walls more than truth. Lewis had said as much on the walk over. "These places," he muttered, "they survive in silence." I let him speak without reply. He was right, of course, but for reasons more layered than he intended. Silence is not mere absence, it is structure, currency, ritual. At St. Simeon's it was a tradition. The porter, watchful in his lodge, barely glanced as we crossed the quad. His expression had the cast of one who has already judged our presence excessive. Beyond him, cloisters stretched in careful symmetry, damp flagstones slick beneath our shoes. A bell struck, low and deliberate, summoning a handful of scholars to prayers. I watched them vanish through an oaken door, robes whispering, eyes downcast. None paused to acknowledge us. The warden's staircase lay to the east, its steps curved unevenly, polished to shine where centuries of feet had climbed with caution. I touched the banister, smooth as glass, and thought of how many generations had gripped it in uncertainty or resolve. The warden himself was waiting, framed by a half-open door. He offered no welcome, only a glance that measured us in silence before retreating into his chambers. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of old vellum and fading coal smoke. Shelves climbed the walls, crowded with volumes that looked seldom disturbed. A decanter stood on a side table, though I noticed the glasses were dusty. The warden gestured to chairs, but not with warmth. He had the aspect of a man long accustomed to control and newly affronted by intrusion. He asked why police were needed when a man had died in his bed. I told him death does not always explain itself, nor does silence protect reputations as fully as one imagines. He frowned, unwilling to argue, yet unwilling to concede. His voice, low and carefully modulated, carried both scholarship and suspicion. Lewis pressed the matter of the bursar's hours, the clippings, the erasures in accounts. The warden listened with the patience of a man enduring a lecture he had not chosen. Finally, he said the bursar was loyal, diligent, perhaps overburdened. If there were irregularities, they would be minor, and the college would correct them quietly. He emphasized the last word with deliberate weight. Quietly. I let the silence lengthen. Silence, after all, is not empty, it reveals. In that pause, I observed his hands. One finger, ink-stained, rested on a letter half concealed beneath a pile of correspondence. He did not notice he had revealed it. The seal was broken, the signature half visible. A name I recognized faintly was one of the directors of the firm that had collapsed in the city. I let my eyes move away before he followed them. We departed without argument, but I carried with me the certainty that the college's loyalty to its dead bursar was less affection than fear. Outside, the quad had emptied. Rain had begun again, soft at first, then more insistent. Students hurried by with collars raised, avoiding puddles that reflected the great windows in fractured light. I slowed my pace deliberately. There is much to be learned in observing how a place breathes when it believes itself unobserved. At the chapel door, an elderly fellow emerged, startled to see us. His gown, frayed at the edges, hung like a memory. He inclined his head, then seemed to change his mind and spoke. Quietly, hurriedly. The bursar had been troubled, he said, walks late at night, muttering in corridors. Once he had been found in the library at an hour when no one should be there, copying passages from an obscure legal volume. The fellow offered no interpretation, merely the facts, then disappeared with the haste of a man who regretted speaking at all. Lewis looked to me for direction. I told him we would visit the library next. He protested it was locked by custom during certain hours, but I reminded him customs yield more readily than people suppose. The library of St. Simeon's is not grand, but it holds a gravity that larger spaces lack. Its air tastes of parchment and dust, and the floorboards complain beneath every footfall. We moved among the shelves slowly, unwilling to disturb more than necessary. I traced my fingers along spines until I found the section the fellow had implied. Law, finance, obscure precedents. One book stood misaligned, withdrawn slightly as though replaced in haste. I drew it out from a volume on bankruptcy law annotated by long-dead scholars. Between its pages lay a slip of paper, thin, lined, torn from a notebook. On it, written in the bursar's hand, a single phrase: liability undisclosed. Nothing more, no context, no figures, only that. I folded the paper, placed it carefully in my pocket. Lewis frowned but did not question. He knew by now that fragments often weigh more than full explanations. We left the library as shadows lengthened. The rain had eased, leaving the quad slick and glistening. I paused beneath the cloister where I had first heard the hymn. The echo had gone, replaced by the faint chatter of students at supper. Yet as I listened, I realized something else. The rhythm of footsteps, uneven, deliberate, familiar. Not the bursars this time, but another limp, lighter, more practiced, someone else carrying weight in silence. Back in my room, I turned again to the crossword. 4 down 5 letters means secret world. The answer came almost at once. Crypt. Appropriate, I thought, for St. Simeon's. A world closed not by doors but by choice. A crypt of scholars protecting knowledge not for enlightenment but for concealment. I poured whiskey, let it sit untasted. My mind replayed the warden's careful phrases, the fellow's whispered account, the bursar's solitary walks, all pieces of a puzzle whose shape I could not yet name. And so the day ended not with revelation, but with the weight of a world determined to remain closed. St. Simeon's had offered me its surface. The truth, I suspected, lay buried beneath, waiting like the echo of a hymn in stone. There are moments in Oxford when one stumbles, quite without intention, into words left behind like crumbs from a forgotten meal. They lie scattered on desks, chalked faintly on boards, murmured in corridors, still holding the echo of their speakers. That day, wandering half in hope, half in resignation, I found myself in a lecture hall at St. Simeon's, not seeking enlightenment, but silence. What I discovered instead were fragments. The hall was nearly empty. Rows of benches bore the dust of inattention, though a faint smell of chalk lingered like incense after Mass. A blackboard still carried the residue of a lecture hastily erased, smudges of white against the dark. I sat midway down, the better to imagine what had been said. A few words, incomplete, clung obstinately at the margins: fiduciary, concealment, breach. Words that would have passed unnoticed in most contexts, yet here, where the bursar had spent his final weeks, they tolled like bells no one wished to hear. I thought of the clipping in his chamber, the slip of paper in the library. Liability, undisclosed. A man does not study bankruptcy law unless forced by necessity. Nor does he whistle hymns in darkened quads unless guilt or fear is already perched upon his shoulder. Lewis joined me after some minutes, his shoes declaring his approach along the wooden floorboards. He sat heavily beside me, exhaling the weariness of one unused to subtle atmospheres. He remarked that it seemed a wasted errand, sitting in an empty hall, staring at half-erased words. I told him, waste is often the disguise of revelation. He chuckled softly, though without mirth. We remained in silence until a junior fellow appeared, surprised to find us there. He asked whether we were searching for something, and I replied only that we were listening. He seemed uneasy, then mentioned almost as an afterthought that the bursar had attended lectures here in his final weeks. Odd, he said, for a man of his age to sit among students, silent, taking no notes. I closed my eyes, imagining the bursar seated alone, staring at words like concealment and breach, as though they might explain his predicament. Was he seeking answers or preparing defences? The distinction is often blurred in men cornered by both debt and conscience. The fellow left hurriedly, unwilling to linger. Lewis asked what I made of it. I offered him only another question. Why would a bursar, keeper of accounts, sit in a hall devoted not to numbers, but to their failure? He frowned, then sighed, accustomed by now to my refusal to give him clarity. When we departed, the corridor outside offered its own lecture. A notice board, cluttered with announcements and forgotten posters, bore one sheet curled at the edges, a seminar long past on corporate collapse. The speaker was the same director whose name I had glimpsed on the warden's half-hidden letter. Coincidence again, or rather the careful choreography of institutions whose members dance together in shadows while pretending not to see. Back in the quad, rain threatened once more. A group of undergraduates hurried by, debating some minor literary quarrel with the energy of those who believe passion is immune to time. Their voices echoed beneath the arch, a reminder that life continues even when death has unsettled its margins. I envied them briefly, then let the envy dissolve into resignation. That evening, I returned to my room with the fragments gathered like brittle leaves, chalk words, clippings, slips of paper. Too little to form a whole, yet too suggestive to discard. I spread them across my desk as one might arrange clues in a crossword, seeking intersections. The puzzle I worked upon that night offered 6 across 7 letters, which means partial truth. I tried candour, honesty, even candida. None fitted. The answer, when it revealed itself, was halfness, an ugly word, and yet exact. Halfness described the bursar's world, the college's explanations, the warden's careful phrases. All half, never whole. I poured whiskey and let it rest in the glass. Across the quad I heard music family students practicing hymns for chapel. Among them, unmistakable, the same 2-note phrase the bursar had whistled. Not unusual, yet it chilled me. Sounds repeat, but their contexts alter. He had whistled in solitude, in darkness they sang in careless harmony. The difference was not in the notes, but in the silence that followed. Later, unable to sleep, I walked again to the lecture hall, empty save for the scent of chalk and wood. I traced with my finger the faint outline of a word not fully erased. Fraud. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition that a man had died with this word, written above him, whether in ink or conscience. As I left, the echo of my footsteps seemed louder than before, amplified by walls that had heard too much and revealed too little. St. Simeon slept, or pretended to. I returned to my room, certain that the bursar's death was not the end of a story, but the middle of a lecture, interrupted mid-sentence. Fragments, nothing more. Yet fragments, when placed together, have a way of forming truths that institutions would rather remain unspoken, and I, unwilling though I am, had already begun listening to the lecture he could no longer finish. It is strange how water in Oxford seems always to carry with it the weight of memory. The river is not merely a river, it is reflection, echo, confessional. That afternoon I found myself walking its edge, though not by intention. Lewis had mentioned a woman, a name passed to him by the porter with reluctance. She had been seen with the bursar, not often, but often enough for rumour to assemble itself in the shadows. She lived by the river, beyond the reach of cloisters and quads, in a cottage pressed close to the banks like a book laid open to the weather. The path there was wet, the kind of wetness that seeps into one's shoes and insists on being noticed. Willows bent low, their branches trailing the current, with gestures both graceful and weary. I carried with me no certainty, only the half-formed notion that grief seldom confines itself to official chambers. It leaks, like rain through old stone, into unlikely places. She opened the door herself without hesitation, as though she had been expecting a visitor, though not necessarily me. Her face was one of those Oxford faces carved by years of watching from margins. Neither young nor old, marked by intelligence that had not found its rightful forum. She invited me in without ceremony. The room smelt of damp wood and faint perfume, an incongruous blend. Books lay scattered on the table, most of them financial in nature. I noticed at once a copy of the very paper from which the bursar had clipped his report. We spoke quietly, as strangers do when both know the conversation carries consequences. She had known him, she said, for years. Not intimately, she was quick to add, but closely enough. He had come to her for advice on matters of money. She had once worked in the city before retreating here to the river's edge. He trusted her, though perhaps he should not have. I asked what advice she had given. She looked toward the window, where the river moved sluggishly under the weight of drizzle. To be cautious, she said. To remember that institutions are slower to forgive than people. That debts written in ledgers have a way of becoming debts written in stone. Lewis, standing awkwardly near the fireplace, shifted his weight, but did not interrupt. He had always been uneasy in rooms where emotion and intellect intertwined. The woman poured tea, though her hands betrayed a tremor she attempted to disguise. I noticed it, as I notice such things. She asked whether the bursar had died peacefully. I told her only that he had died alone. She did not reply at once, but her silence carried the weight of knowing that peace and solitude are seldom the same. On a small side table lay a notebook, half open, its pages marked with figures. Without intrusion, I allowed my gaze to rest upon them numbers, columns, the faint outline of sums that mirrored those I had glimpsed in the bursar's accounts. A pattern emerged, not complete, but insistent money transferred, withdrawn, redirected. Small amounts, accumulating like drops into a bucket. She closed the notebook with a motion too swift to be casual. I did not protest. Instead, I asked whether she had seen him recently. Her voice faltered as she admitted he had come only days before his death. He had been agitated, carrying with him another clipping, speaking of collapse, of exposure. He had asked whether ruin, once begun, could be reversed. She told him it could not without sacrifice greater than most men would make. She looked at me then, directly, and asked whether I believed he had taken his own life. I let the question hover unanswered. To answer would have been to grant her relief or despair, and I carried neither to give. The river outside moved with slow inevitability. I thought of how debts, like rivers, gather tributaries until they overwhelm their banks. I thought too of hymns, of echoes, of chalk words half erased, all fragments pressing toward meaning. Lewis cleared his throat, clumsy in his kindness, and asked if she wished to add anything for the record. She smiled faintly at the phrase. "The record," she murmured, "is never the same as the truth." Then she turned her eyes back to the river, ending the conversation without dismissal. We left the cottage in silence, The path back seemed longer, though perhaps it was only the weight of what we carried. Rain fell steadily now, blurring the outlines of willows and water alike. At a bend in the path I paused, compelled by something half-remembered. The crossword from the night before, 12, across 5 letters, means witness. The answer had eluded me until then. The woman by the river, her silence, her notebook, her tremor. The word, plain and irrefutable, was seer. Not a witness in the legal sense, but one who sees more than she dares to say. Back in my room, I sat with the thought. She had seen, she had known, but she had not spoken in full. Perhaps she feared the college, perhaps herself, perhaps the river that had already taken too much from her. I could not know. What I did know was that the bursar's life had been entangled with hers, not in passion, but in secrecy, and secrecy is often the heavier bond. I poured whiskey, darker than the river, and let it rest untasted. Outside, the rain thickened, striking the stone with rhythms both monotonous and consoling. I thought of her face, her voice, her silence, and I wondered whether the bursar's hymn had been meant for God, for himself, or for the woman who had once told him that debts endure longer than love. The river moved on, carrying with it fragments of a life I was only beginning to assemble, and I, unwillingly, but inevitably, followed its course. The library at St. Simeon's had always seemed to me more like a mausoleum than a living place. Books do not merely wait upon their shelves, there they haunt. Dust gathers not in carelessness, but in reverence, as if each particle were another layer of secrecy applied deliberately to words already cloaked. It was into this atmosphere that I returned, late in the day, with the sense that the bursar's footsteps had not yet faded from its boards. The porter, reluctant as ever, had unlocked the door with a look that suggested complicity in trespass. Lewis followed me inside, though uneasily. He has never shared my affection for libraries. To him they are places of dryness, of whispers too faint to trust. But to me they are cathedrals, and cathedrals always tell their truths obliquely. The long room stretched before us, its windows offering only a thin light, grey and lifeless. The smell was of paper grown brittle and floorboards that had known generations. We moved slowly between the shelves, the silence more eloquent than speech. I thought again of the fellow who had whispered about the bursar's late visits, the copying of passages from obscure volumes. Men seldom seek law in hours meant for sleep unless they are already condemned by conscience. It was Lewis who noticed the box first. A small wooden chest tucked behind a row of folios, almost hidden but not enough. He gestured toward it without words. I lifted it down carefully, the wood cool, the lock broken as if by a hurried hand. Inside were letters, tied not neatly, but with a string frayed to its final strength. I untied them slowly, unwilling to rush what the bursar had perhaps meant to keep. They were not from family. No affectionate greetings, no shared memories. They were businesslike, precise, but written in a hand that revealed both urgency and restraint. I recognized at once the name at the bottom of more than one, the same director I had glimpsed in the warden's hidden correspondence. The content was not explicit. It seldom is in such cases. Allusions to obligations, reminders of discretion, phrases carefully chosen to suggest pressure without demanding it outright. One line lingered in my mind even as I read on. Failure to comply may bring consequences beyond remedy. Lewis muttered that it looked like blackmail. I told him blackmail is a crude word, and these letters were anything but crude. They were academic in their precision, financial in their menace. It was not money alone they demanded, but silence, cooperation, complicity. As I read, I noticed that several of the bursar's replies were missing. The sequence was broken, one side of the conversation present, the other absent. It struck me then that absence in correspondence speaks more loudly than presence. What is withheld, destroyed, or never written is often the truer confession. At the bottom of the chest lay one envelope, unlike the rest. It bore no address, no seal, but within it was a single sheet. In the bursar's hand again, though less steady than before, a list of figures, columns uneven, totals scrawled hastily. Beside one sum he had written a single word, river. I closed my eyes and thought of the woman by the river, her notebook, her tremor. Connections forming not as certainty but as shadow. Lewis asked whether we should remove the letters for evidence. I told him evidence is not always best when carried in pockets. Sometimes it speaks loudest when left precisely where it lies, waiting for the right eyes to return. He sighed, accustomed now to my preference for ambiguity over action. We placed the letters back, though not exactly as we had found them. I allowed one envelope to remain slightly skewed, enough that any future hand returning would betray itself. A small trick, but one I have learned from crosswords. Place the word not where it fits too easily, but where it strains the reader into honesty. As we turned to leave, I paused at the table near the window. There, among ink blots and dust, lay another fragment of lecture notes, unsigned. A single line, underlined twice concealment, is not absence, but arrangement. I traced the words with my finger, aware of their truth in ways the writer might not have intended. Outside, evening had drawn itself tightly around the college. The rain had ceased, but the stones still glistened as though reluctant to release the water they had absorbed. I lingered beneath the cloister, listening for echoes. None came. Only silence, deliberate, arranged. Back in my room, I sat once more with my crossword. 8 down 6 letters means letters unspoken. I considered mute, tacit, and secret. None satisfied. Then, almost reluctantly, the answer revealed itself unsaid. It seemed a poor word, insufficient for the weight of silence borne by the bursar, the woman, the warden, the college itself. Yet perhaps poor words are truest in their inadequacy. I poured a measure of whiskey, letting it remain untouched. I thought of the bursar in that library, alone, copying words by candlelight, tying letters with trembling hands. I thought of the chest, hidden but not hidden enough, the broken lock, the string frayed. And I realized then, though I could not yet prove it, that his death had been less an escape than an arrangement. Someone had orchestrated the silence, chosen carefully what would remain, what would vanish, letters, clippings, fragments of lectures, all arranged with the precision of a man constructing his own epitaph, or of another ensuring it for him. The library slept again, its truths concealed not by absence, but by order. And I, restless in the night, listened to the echo of words never spoken, letters never sent, meanings never finished. In Oxford, silence is never empty. It is only arranged. The college cellars are older than the students, older than the dons, older even than the memories that cling so stubbornly to its cloisters. They breathe a damp, unrepentant air, soaked with the sediment of centuries. It was there, one evening, that I found myself guided by a reluctant subursar who believed formality sufficient to disguise his unease. Wine, after all, is both indulgence and ledger entry, and St. Simeon's kept more of both than was strictly necessary. The door opened on a corridor of barrels, each marked with dates that spoke more of tradition than taste. The smell was thick, sweet, and mouldering, as though grapes had died and been buried beneath stone. I let my eyes adjust, then allowed my fingers to trace the chalk marks on the nearest cask, figures written, rubbed away, written again. Even wine, it seemed, endured its own concealments. The sub-bursar spoke nervously of inventories. Each vintage accounted for, each bottle numbered. Yet when I asked for the bursar's last inspection, his voice faltered. Months ago, he admitted, records delayed. His excuse that illness had slowed, the man sounded rehearsed. I noticed how he would not meet my eyes when he spoke. On a shelf beside the account book lay a bottle, uncorked, its contents half drained. Unusual in such a place where discipline of the ledger outweighs indulgence of the palate. Lewis lifted it, sniffed, frowned. I told him to replace it. There are moments when evidence must remain undisturbed, even if only to unsettle those who know it lingers there. I turned the pages of the cellar log, columns of numbers, tidy and precise, until one page where the neatness broke. Figures scrawled, overwritten, amended, a sum larger than any single bottle could justify. And beside it, the bursar's hand again, that hurried script I had already come to recognize. He had written one word in the margin. I paused over it, tasting its ambiguity. Will, as in determination, will, as in testament. The seller offered no answer, yet I knew that word had not been written idly. Men who balance ledgers with such obsessive care do not scrawl words without reason. Lewis muttered that perhaps the bursar had been drinking. I shook my head. He was not a man for excess. His indulgence, if any, was in caution. No, the bottle half-drained was not pleasure but signal. Something left for another to find. We climbed back into the open air, leaving the sub-bursar relieved to retreat into his calculations. I told Lewis we must see the bursar's papers again. Wills, ledgers, letters form their own chorus, each voice contradicting, each demanding attention. Back in his chamber, the room still carried its chill of abandonment. The desk bore papers we had overlooked before, folded too neatly to attract attention. I spread them out slowly. Among them, beneath the ordinary correspondence, I found a draft of his will, unfinished, unsigned, bequests scribbled, names written and crossed out, sums altered. He had left the college something, then nothing, then something again, the hesitation of a man torn between duty and resentment. Most striking was a line struck through so fiercely the paper tore. A name, female, recognizable. The woman by the river, at first bequeathed a small sum, then erased. I closed my eyes a moment, hearing again her tremor, her silence, her evasions. She had spoken of trust, of advice, yet here was proof of deeper entanglement. Lewis read over my shoulder, uncomfortable. He asked if she could have pressured him. I replied only that it will reveal more of the living than of the dead. The bursar had been struggling not only with accounts, but with loyalties. He had sought to leave, to give, to erase, all at once. That torn paper bore his true anguish more than any hymn in the quad. As we sat in silence, I noticed a small blot of red ink in the margin of another page. Not unusual pens bleed, but it was shaped oddly, like a letter abandoned halfway. An initial, perhaps, or a symbol only he understood. I leaned closer. The shape resembled a cross, imperfect, hurried, the same shape I had seen penciled in the margin of a newspaper in the porter's lodge. Not a coincidence. A man repeating his own code, scattering signs for anyone perceptive enough to follow. We left the chamber with nothing officially altered, yet my pockets carried the echo of discovery. The bursar had been drafting a legacy, fragmentary and conflicted. Between wine cellars and river cottages, between ledgers and wills, he had entangled himself in obligations too tangled to resolve. That night, in my room, the crossword offered me 10 down 8 letters, which means inheritance. The answer was bequest. Simple, inevitable. Yet I stared at it for long minutes, unwilling to write it in. bequest was too neat, too certain, while the bursar's will had been anything but. His bequests were erased, altered, denied. His true inheritance, perhaps, was silence, passed on to those who remained. I poured whiskey and let the glass rest untouched on the table. The sound of rain against the window seemed less like weather than punctuation. Each drop a comma, a hesitation in a sentence the bursar had begun but never finished. Wine, wills, words, all fragments, arranged but unresolved. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself to imagine him in those final hours alone in his chamber, drafting and redrafting, torn between duty and betrayal. The hymn on his lips, the limp in his step, the letters tied with string. Oxford does not forgive easily, nor does it forget. St. Simeon's, in its cellars and its wills, had already chosen to remember him in silence. It was I, against my better judgment, who listened still. And listening, I could hear the faint echo of a man who had tried to arrange his truth, only to have it drowned in the ledger's ink and the river's current. So I closed the crossword unfinished and sat in the dark, the taste of wine and wills heavy on my tongue, though I had swallowed neither. It was in all places that the investigation seemed to drift furthest from its moorings. Hall, with its long tables polished by generations of elbows, its portraits of long-dead benefactors scowling into eternity, its draughts creeping beneath the great doors. A place of meals and murmurs, not revelations. Yet it was there that I found myself, listening less to what was spoken than to the rhythm beneath it. The dons were gathered in unusual force that evening, their gowns drawn about them like armour. Dinner in college is never quite about food, it is about position, about the theatre of glances and pauses. The bursar's absence was noted in silence rather than speech. His chair, conspicuously empty, seemed almost more occupied than any of the others. Lewis sat beside me, ill at ease, shifting on the bench as though the wood itself resisted him. He whispered that the whole occasion felt like a play staged for our benefit. I told him quietly that all dinners are played. The trick is recognizing which character refuses his lines. Conversation rose and fell along the tables. I caught fragments of the collapse of firms in the city, the decline of Latin in schools, the weather, always the weather. Yet beneath these topics lay an undercurrent, as if every remark sought to build a wall against intrusion. It reminded me of a crossword I had attempted earlier that day. 7 down 9 letters means deliberate distraction. I had written red herring only to find it did not fit. Too many letters, too obvious, and here, too, the red herrings seemed placed with excessive care, their colours too bright, their placement too deliberate. The warden presided with an expression of studied neutrality. His hands rested on the tablecloth, fingers still ink-stained. When his eyes drifted toward me, they carried not welcome, but warning. I returned the look without comment. In such exchanges, silence serves better than speech. Midway through the meal, a fellow leaned toward me, his breath carrying the bitterness of claret. He murmured something about the bursar's fondness for river walks, then laughed too quickly, as though eager to drown the implication. His sleeve brushed mine, and I noticed the faintest smudge of chalk on the fabric. A lecture unfinished, a blackboard erased in haste, or something more. The detail lodged itself in my mind, not yet significant but unwilling to be ignored. Lewis grew restless. He muttered that we were being mocked, fed half-truths and gossip, while the real matter lay elsewhere. I told him that mockery itself is often a clue. Those who laugh too loudly do so to prevent their words from being heard. He frowned, dissatisfied, but did not press further. When the pudding was served, I excused myself under the pretense of needing air. In truth, I sought distance, a vantage from which to observe without being observed. I lingered in the shadows near the high windows, listening. It was then I caught a phrase, spoken carelessly by one of the younger dons, liability undisclosed. The very words from the bursar's note in the library. The phrase, once encountered in isolation, now emerged in the living world, wrapped in laughter, passed off as academic banter. But I knew better. Words repeat for reasons. The fellow who had spoken noticed me watching and quickly shifted the topic to the college choir, their upcoming evensong, and the difficulty of balancing rehearsals with tutorials. A harmless subject, or so it seemed. Yet the abruptness of the change betrayed him. I wrote the moment in memory as one writes a number, in the margin tentative, awaiting its connection. Later, when the meal ended and the hall emptied into the drizzle beyond the doors, I remained behind a moment longer. The bursar's chair, still empty, seemed to accuse the others of complicity. I ran my hand lightly along the table, where wine had spilled, leaving faint rings. A trivial observation, perhaps. Yet in one place the stain had been rubbed with unusual force, as if someone had sought to erase a mark too revealing. Outside, Lewis asked whether I had learned anything. I told him only that I had learned how much effort it takes to tell nothing. He sighed, weary, and suggested we return to the porter's lodge. I refused. Better, I thought, to walk the quad alone and let the silence settle. As I walked, the rain fell lightly, tracing the stones with glistening lines. I recalled again the crossword red herring, too many letters. The true answer, which had eluded me until then, was diversion. 9 letters. Diversion fits perfectly. And that was precisely what the evening in the hall had been, a diversion carefully staged, designed to occupy our senses while the truth moved elsewhere, unseen. I returned to my room past midnight, the echo of laughter still lingering in my ears. I poured whiskey and allowed it to rest on the table, untouched. I thought of the bursar, seated perhaps at that very table, in evenings past, laughing too little, listening too much. A man caught between loyalty and exposure, silence and confession. The hall that night had offered me no answers. Only distractions, diversions, and red herrings. Yet sometimes the value lies not in what is given, but in what is withheld. I closed the crossword, unfinished still, and sat in the darkness with only the rain for company, waiting for the fragments to declare themselves. I have always distrusted drawers. They are too much like the human mind, appearing ordered on the surface, but once pulled open, revealing a chaos of items tucked away in haste, half forgotten, or meant never to be seen. The bursar's chamber had yielded its ledgers and its will, but not its whole self. I returned there late, when the college corridors were emptied of footsteps, the lamps casting shadows longer than the men who once lit them. The porter, reluctant but pliable, allowed me entry with a key borrowed from custom rather than authority. Lewis followed, his face drawn by the hour, though his patience endured longer than most men's would. We entered without ceremony. The room was as I remembered curtains, breathing with the draught, the smell of ink and faint tobacco, the dust of abandonment already beginning its quiet work. It was at the desk that I lingered again. Papers stacked, some deliberately, some hurriedly, all carrying the residue of a man who had known he had little time left. The top drawer slid open easily, pens, sealing wax, scraps of paper. Innocent. The second resisted, stiff with disuse, and when it yielded it revealed envelopes unaddressed, receipts from the grocer, a pair of spectacles cracked at the rim. It was the third drawer that stopped me, locked but not with determination. The key, I suspected, had been left deliberately elsewhere. I looked about the room and found it within minutes, hanging from the frame of a portrait, absurd in its openness. A man who wishes to hide never leaves his key so visible. A man who wishes to be found does. I unlocked the drawer. Within lay only a small stack of papers bound together with a faded ribbon, and beside them a photograph. The photograph was black and white, curling at the edges. The bursar stood with two others, a woman and a man, younger, sharply dressed. Behind them, the unmistakable facade of a firm in the city, its brass plate catching the light. The woman I recognized at once was the figure by the river. The man I knew only from the warden's half-hidden correspondence, the director whose name had haunted every clue. Lewis leaned over my shoulder. He exhaled slowly, murmuring that it looked like proof of connection. I said nothing. Proof is a luxury detectives seldom possess. We live instead on suggestion, inference, the fragile threads of human error. Still, the image carried its own weight. I studied the bursar's face. He was not smiling, though the others were. His eyes held the vacancy of a man already resigned. The photograph, whatever its purpose, had been meant as a record. And records, however innocent, can condemn. Beside it, the papers bound with ribbon contained drafts of letters never sent. One addressed to the warden, another to the woman, another to no one in particular. Words crossed out, rewritten, abandoned. I read fragments only, apologies, warnings, phrases about sums mislaid, obligations unmet, faith betrayed. Each letter stopped short, unfinished, as if the bursar had found his words inadequate or too dangerous to deliver. One line, however, had not been crossed out. It read simply, "They will come for me by twilight." I closed my eyes, hearing the bursar's whistle in the quad, those two notes echoing against stone. A hymn, yes, but also perhaps a warning sung only to himself. Lewis asked whether the photograph should be taken as evidence. I shook my head. Evidence in college rooms has a way of vanishing into archives where silence is prized more than truth. Better, I told him, that it remains here, where those who knew of its existence would betray themselves by their attempts to remove it. As we left the chamber, I slipped the drawer closed with care. The key I replaced upon the portrait's frame, where it would wait like a silent invitation for the next hand. The corridor outside was long, the floorboards complaining beneath our weight. Somewhere distant, a clock struck the hour. I counted the chimes distractedly until I lost count. Lewis asked if I believed the bursar had been blackmailed. I told him blackmail is only the bluntest word for pressures that are usually far subtler. A man may be compelled not only by money but by loyalty, shame, and memory. He frowned, dissatisfied, but said no more. That night, back in my room, I turned again to my crossword. 6 across 11 letters means image preserved. I tried photography, portraits, and remembrance. None quite satisfied. The true answer, when it emerged, was memento. And I understood then that the photograph in the drawer was precisely that, not proof, not evidence, but memento. Left for someone, perhaps for me, perhaps for the woman, perhaps for no one at all. I poured whiskey and let it sit, its surface reflecting the dim light. I thought of the bursar, seated at his desk, locking the drawer, placing the key so visibly above him. He had known his time was short. He had arranged his fragments not as defense but as legacy. And legacy, like wine, like wills, is seldom what men intend it to be. The photograph remained there, curled at the edges, bearing silent witness to a triangle of faces, I could not know yet which of the three had most to lose, but I knew the bursar had already lost everything, and so I sat with the image in my mind, its silence heavier than any words, while the rain returned to strike the stones outside like fingers upon a locked drawer, asking to be opened. There is a cruelty in lectures, I have often thought, though few will admit it. Words delivered with authority to a room of the silent, the passive, the unwilling. The bursar, I was told, had spent his last week seated in those echoing benches, absorbing discourses on law and finance, without ever speaking. To return there now was less to retrace his steps than to submit myself to the same silent discipline, hoping that what he heard I, too, might overhear. The hall was empty at first, its windows clouded by drizzle, the boards beneath my shoes protesting like reluctant witnesses. Chalk still marked the blackboard, though in broken fragments that clung like ghosts' liability, concealment, remedy. Words that had already haunted me in other places, other margins. I took a seat halfway down the row, the place I imagined he might have chosen, far enough back to avoid notice, near enough to pretend attentiveness. I closed my eyes. I could almost hear the drone of a voice, the scrape of pens, the suppressed coughs of students less enthralled by bankruptcy law than by the passing of time. What had he sought here? Instruction? Salvation? Or only the quiet that comes when another voice carries the burden of speaking? Lewis arrived soon after, as ever with his skepticism carried openly in his step. He muttered that we were wasting hours, that empty halls yield no secrets. I did not reply. Silence was the truer method here. He sat beside me, fidgeting, while I let the fragments arrange themselves. On the lecturer's desk lay a sheaf of notes left behind. Abandoned, perhaps, or deliberately placed. I leafed through them slowly, finding notations in a hand different from the formal script of the lecture, marginalia hurried, personal. One line caught me: disclosure must precede trust. Another: concealment breeds liability. The words seemed ordinary, yet in their repetition across different contexts they acquired weight. At the bottom of the pile was a page torn roughly from a student's notebook. A doodle of interlocked squares, meaningless at first glance, but I noticed how certain corners were shaded darker than others. Not a doodle, then, but a diagram of something concealed and revealed, arrangement rather than accident. I slipped it into my pocket without explanation to Lewis. Some fragments announced their importance only later. We left the hall and found the fellow who had last lectured there, a man of thinning hair and eyes too quick to settle. He greeted us without enthusiasm, remarking that the bursar's attendance had been peculiar but not disruptive. He said the man never asked questions, never spoke, only stared at the board with an intensity that unsettled even the students. He added reluctantly that once the bursar had remained after the others had gone, copying notes not meant for distribution. When asked why, he replied simply that I may need them. That phrase, I may need them, lingered in me as much as the chalk words themselves, a man anticipating judgment, hoarding language as another might hoard coins. Lewis pressed the fellow for more, but the man shrugged, unwilling to embroider. He left us at the door, his gown trailing like the end of a sentence. Outside, the drizzle had thickened to rain, coating the cobblestones until they gleamed beneath the lamps. I walked in silence, Lewis trailing at a distance. My mind returned not to the bursar, but to the photograph in the drawer. 3 figures, one expressionless, one smiling, one sharp-eyed. The bursar had sat in lectures where liability and concealment were spoken of as abstractions. For him, they had been present, living, sitting beside him in photographs and letters alike. Back in my room, the crossword lay open. 15 across 8 letters means lesson not yet learned. I considered various answers, teaching sermon parable. None fit. The correct solution eventually was misteach. An ugly word, but perhaps the right one. Misteach what the bursar had endured, or what he had sought, was not truth, but a distortion of it, a lesson misshaped by the pressure of silence. I poured whiskey, but left it untouched, watching the rain thicken against the glass. The bursar had returned again and again to lectures he could not understand, or perhaps understood too well. He had listened to words about trust and disclosure, while his own trust crumbled, his disclosures delayed until they consumed him. There was no revelation that night, only the growing certainty that knowledge in Oxford is seldom enlightenment. It is more often camouflage, a cloak draped over debts, loyalties, betrayals. The bursar had not been a student in those benches. He had been a supplicant kneeling before words he hoped might absolve him. The lecture reconsidered revealed not the law but the man, and the man reconsidered revealed the college, and the college reconsidered revealed only itself, which is to say, nothing. I closed the crossword unfinished, sat in the dim silence, and let the rain write its own lecture on the window pane. A lecture of fragments, pauses, disclosures withheld. A lecture I alone attended, and which offered no conclusions. It was nearing the close of the day when the last conversation took place, though I did not know at the time it would be final. Oxford's sky had dimmed to a colour that defies naming something between slate and ash, as though the heavens had rubbed out their own light. I walked slowly through the quad, the air damp with the residue of earlier rain, and each step felt heavier than the last. A porter's lamp flickered in the lodge while the rest of the college appeared already asleep. The warden had requested my presence, though the word request in his mouth sounded more like command. His rooms were lit too brightly, as if illumination could replace sincerity. He stood by the hearth, not seated, his hands clasped behind his back, in a pose rehearsed over years of authority. He asked me what I had found. I told him fragments, only fragments. He nodded, as though fragments were less dangerous than facts. He spoke of loyalty, of the college's reputation, of how men sometimes falter under pressure too great to endure. His voice carried a rhythm carefully composed, much like the lectures I had lately haunted. I listened without interruption. Yet it was not the words that struck me, but the way he avoided glancing at the desk where his letters lay stacked, too neatly, as though arranged for inspection he hoped would never come. I asked him gently whether he had known of the bursar's dealings with the firm now ruined. He hesitated, and in that hesitation I found more than any confession. A man who pauses before denial has already admitted in silence what his words will soon disguise. He muttered something about misunderstandings, small obligations, errors of judgment. I let the words dissolve into the air. Lewis, patient but restless, stood at the edge of the room, shifting from foot to foot. He asked outright whether funds had been misused. The warden replied with a phrase so vague it might have belonged in a sermon. Resources sometimes wander before they return to their rightful place. I closed my eyes briefly. Wandering resources, an elegant cloak for theft or complicity or both. What I remember most, however, was not his explanation but his gesture. As he spoke, he raised a hand to his collar, adjusting it unnecessarily, then let his fingers linger against the chain of a watch that hung at his waistcoat. An ordinary gesture, but one I had seen before, in the photograph. The director in the city had worn the same chain, the same watch, the same unconscious touch. Not a coincidence. Association. I left him with a few words. To accuse would have been to grant him the chance of denial. Better to carry silence away and let it settle where it would. Later, in my room, there was another conversation. The woman by the river had come, unannounced, her face pale from the cold air. She asked only one thing, whether his death had been quick. I told her it had been quiet, which was not the same. She sat without invitation, her hands folded tightly. She confessed then, though not in the manner of the guilty. She admitted to advising him, yes, to warning him of debts that could not be reversed, of obligations that would consume him. But she denied pressing him further. He had spoken of leaving her something in his will, then striking it out, then rewriting it again. She had begged him not to. She wanted no money, only release from the burden of being remembered where she did not belong. I asked her why she trembled when she spoke of him. She said quietly that she had known too many men broken by loyalty to institutions that loved them only for their silence. I thought of the bursar in his chamber, writing and erasing, drafting and discarding, until his life became one long footnote to a ledger no one else would read. She left as suddenly as she had come, the river's scent lingering in the room after her departure. Alone once more, I turned to the crossword. 13 down 10 letters means end of dialogue. I tried silence, conclusion, and aftermath. None fit. At last the answer revealed itself. An unwelcome but exact conversation. The word itself carried the weight of finality, as if all talk eventually arrives at its own death. I poured whiskey, the measure heavier than usual, and drank it slowly. The bursar's hymn returned to me in memory, those 2 notes echoing against stone, a fragment of faith or despair or warning, perhaps all 3. The final conversation had not been with the warden, nor with the woman, nor even with Lewis. It had been with the bursar himself, though he had spoken only in fragments, photographs, letters, chalk words, half-drained bottles, erased sums. His language had been silence, his punctuation absence. And it was I who had been forced to translate, poorly, inadequately. Oxford outside lay still, its quads glistening from the rain, its windows dark, its cloisters holding more secrets than I could ever decipher. I leaned back in my chair, the crossword unfinished, the whiskey glass empty, and allowed the silence to gather around me. The final conversation, like all others in this case, had ended not with revelation, but with fragments, arranged but unresolved. And perhaps that was the truest resolution, that in Oxford truth is not discovered but buried, and those who dig are left with nothing but silence echoing in stone. The case ended, if such things ever do, not in a courtroom, nor in the neat precision of a report, but in the quiet return of sound across the quad. I remember that evening with a clarity sharper than any evidence, the lamps struggling against mist, the rain reluctant but persistent, the cloisters breathing their centuries of secrecy. Oxford always restores itself, swallowing disturbance into the greater hum of continuity. Yet for me the air still carried the whistle of a dead man, faint, uncertain, echoing where he once walked. Lewis had gone by then, tired of fragments. He preferred conclusions even when unsatisfactory. I envied him. My own mind circles like a bird reluctant to land, returning again and again to what cannot be finished. Alone in the quad, I allowed the silence to gather until it pressed against me like another presence. The bursar's face returned, pale, resigned. The woman's tremor at the river, the warden's evasions, the photograph curling at the edges. Each fragment lay before me like tiles in a puzzle missing more than it contained. I had assembled them, yes, but no image emerged in full. Only absence made it whole. The porter passed me once, his lamp swinging low. He nodded, but did not pause. I wondered what he carried unspokenly, what he had seen in late walks, what he had chosen never to record in the lodge book. Porters always know more than their ledgers suggest. Silence is their trade. I sat on the stone bench beneath the cloister, where I had first heard those two notes. The echo, when it came again, was not music, but memory of the bursar's limp heel and toe, uneven against the stone. I closed my eyes and let the sound assemble itself in my mind until I could almost see him there, shadow moving through shadow, whistling his hymn to an audience of none. And still, fragments. In my pocket I carried the crossword folded from that day's paper. 11 across 7 letters means what remains. I tried relics, remnants, and residues, none fit. At last, reluctantly, I saw the answer. Echoes, it fit perfectly, and yet its neatness unsettled me. Echoes remain, yes, but they are not themselves. They are only distortions, fading repetitions, the ghost of a sound long vanished. What remains is not the man, but the hollow of his presence. I wrote the answer lightly, as though ashamed of solving what could not be solved. The rain thickened, drops pattered against the flagstones, merging with the faint rhythm of remembered footsteps. I thought of the bursar's final hours, the drawer unlocked, the key placed too openly, the will half-written, the letters tied with string. Was it despair? Was it an arrangement? Was it someone else's hand closing the circle? I could not know. Perhaps that is what troubles me most, that knowledge in Oxford, for all its pretence, is so often indistinguishable from ignorance. We gather lectures, notes, clippings, wills, photographs. We interpret margins, half-erased chalk, broken locks, and yet the truth, if it exists at all, remains concealed in the silences between. I rose at last and walked slowly across the quad. The stones were slick, each step deliberate, cautious. In one corner a student hurried past, his gown pulled close, his eyes lowered. He did not notice me. The life of the college had already resumed, indifferent to the death that had unsettled it. Back in my room, I poured whiskey and watched the glass cloud with condensation. I thought of the bursar's hymn, of the woman's silence, of the warden's evasions, of Lewis's impatience. Each had played a part, each had left an echo, and I, unwilling recorder, had been left to listen. The crossword lay open still. Echoes, written faintly at 11 across, seemed the only answer I would ever be given. Not truth, not certainty, not revelation. Only echoes. I leaned back in my chair and allowed the night to advance. Rain tapped against the window, the sound carrying the same rhythm as the quad beneath my feet. Heel, toe, heel, toe. The bursar's final walk replayed in the voice of weather itself. So it ended there, not with clarity, but with echoes in the quad. And I, as always, listening more than I spoke, hearing more than I could ever prove, sitting alone with whiskey and silence in a city that keeps its secrets better than any man ever could,